this very distinguished panel set out for us the legal framework, the actuality on the ground, and then suggestions for the way forward. But just to remind us that we're talking this morning, not sure about anybody else, but when I first started doing this work, I really didn't understand myself as a human rights defender. But if the work that you do involves standing up for vulnerable people, children, the disabled, women, then you're a human rights defender. If the work you do involves standing up for people's right to join trade unions, to a decent standard of living, to a healthy environment, to education, to due process, to life, to freedom from discrimination, then you're a human rights defender. If you speak on behalf of those who have no voice, then you are a human rights defender. And it is critically important that the work that you do is recognized as such, protected, and valued, because it is this work that will carry forward a human rights agenda for the 21st century. So with that, I'm going to ask Mandeep Jiwana, Civil Society Watch Program Officer of Civicus, to talk to us about threats to human rights defenders in law, policy, and practice.
Thank you, Caroline. When President Bush announced after 9/11 that freedom is under attack, he meant it. Because we see immediately after 9/11, the Security Council Resolution 1373 was passed, which mandated all states to undertake counterterrorism measures and then report back on them. And soon after the Security Council resolution, we saw a number of governments starting to put in place counter-terror legislation, starting to give their police more powers, starting to reduce fair trial standards, and this trend caught on. And in fact, what happened was the more mature democracies, the countries that preached human rights to the rest of the world, were the first ones when they were faced with these big challenges, but they were the first one to reduce their standards. And this led to a great rollback in civil liberties, in human rights standards. And in fact, this decade is probably the worst decade since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was established, was agreed upon by members of the international community. And we saw that slowly, all those hard-fought liberties, all those hard-fought freedoms that that human rights defenders had struggled for in the past were slowly being chipped away. They were slowly being eroded. Human rights defenders came under attack. They were called as apologists for the terrorists. They were often labeled anti-national elements. And we saw this happen all over the world, and also in the Commonwealth. Now, what is different? The Commonwealth is one institution which says that it prioritizes human rights. It says that it stands for human rights. And it says that human rights are at the center of the Commonwealth. Then why is it, if we look at all the reports, there are a number of reports, there's Freedom House's annual survey, there's the report by FIDH on human rights defenders, there's the reports by Human Rights Watch, there's reports by Amnesty International, and we see that Commonwealth countries are not faring any better than non-Commonwealth countries. But why is it that the Commonwealth is lagging behind in all of this? And I think this is something we as civil society people, as human rights defenders who work in Commonwealth countries, need to tell our leaders, need to tell those who run the Commonwealth that this is a great anomaly. There has to be, and we have to reduce the gap between rhetoric and practice. So coming on that, I mean, of course, I work for Civicus, which is an international NGO. We monitor the space for civil society, and particularly from the rubric of the 3 civil society freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. And since last CHOGM, we've seen that a number of countries, a number of Commonwealth countries, have actually done more to erode human rights than to protect human rights. And some of the trends that we've seen that are emerging are, I mean, the credibility of human rights defenders has been questioned in many parts of the Commonwealth. Sri Lanka is one case which stands out, where a number of human rights defenders have been accused of holding a brief for the rebels. this has been slowly followed by restrictive legislation. This has been followed by anti-terror legislation, where people who speak out against government excesses have actually been charged for inciting violence against the state. They have been labeled as threats to public order, peace, and security of the country. There have also been character assassinations. A number of human rights defenders have actually had to, they've been, especially in a number of Commonwealth countries in Africa, there is the thing, you are suitcase NGOs, you have no brief, where is your constituency? But civil society by itself, civil society takes up unpopular causes. We don't follow the majoritarian view because we take up the causes of those who are left behind, whether it's religious minorities, whether it's sexual minorities, whether it's refugee rights. By tradition, we take up unpopular causes which do not find space in the regular political process. And when we take up these causes, we find that often we are attacked. Our credibility, our personal reputations are attacked. There's false litigation, motivated prosecutions that are carried out against human rights defenders. In my own country, India, which at international forums always talks about the vibrancy of its civil society. If you hear our government speak, they always, oh, we have a great civil society, we have a great democracy. But one of the most eminent human rights defenders in our country, a Gandhian who has publicly and privately abjured violence, was accused of being a terrorist. He was charged under the most harsh anti-terror legislation in India. And it wasn't just the government. He was refused bail by the district court. He was refused bail by the High Court. He was refused bail by the Supreme Court of India, which says it is a bastion of protecting democracy. And finally, after about a year and a half, he was released on bail. So we find these trends that are carrying on in a number of Commonwealth countries. Then there is, of course, the attacks, the intimidation that happens. Of course, recently we've seen Gambia's president saying that human rights defenders are a threat to the country's sovereignty. He says that he will kill human rights defenders when he sees them. But Gambia is not the only country. It is happening in so many other countries. It's happening in so many other places. We've heard all this talk about the importance of civil society in the last 2 days. We've had all the high dignitaries who've been saying civil society is so important. Well, if civil society is so important, then why are there so many attacks on human rights defenders in Commonwealth countries? Why is it that there has been such restrictive legislation that is being introduced? For instance, very soon, in July, Zambia, a Commonwealth country again, introduced a very highly restrictive NGO law. The NGO law actually mandates that the government can ask NGOs to include in their priorities. The government can tell NGOs which areas to focus on, which thematic areas to work on, which thematic areas not to focus on. They also require human rights NGOs to actually coordinate their plans with the government's political priorities. So through legislation, we are seeing all of these things that are coming in. In Uganda, recently, a anti-homosexuality bill has been introduced in Parliament. The bill is extremely, extremely repugnant. In fact, the objectives of the bill state that the bill is designed to to stop the activities of LGBT people, but also sexual rights activists who are trying to force their values of sexual promiscuity on the people of Uganda. Now that is unparliamentary language to say at the least, but these are issues we Commonwealth heads of government need to take up. These are values that, if the values that the Commonwealth stands for are being eroded so openly, and apart from that, there are other repugnant parts of this bill which actually say that if a person has sex with a person of the same gender, there's life imprisonment for that person. And if an HIV-affected person has sex with a person of the same gender, it's imprisonment by death. And a human rights organization or an NGO that promotes the rights of LGBT people, that organization, the head of the organization, of course, will be sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. That's what the law says, the bill says. So it's yet to become law, but I think that's a space for us now here to see these to actually call the governments out on these repugnant acts. We've also seen censorship on the media, especially through anti-terror legislation. The anti-terror legislation has such a wide ambit, and especially where a number of media persons, the independent media, of course, we will be talking about the media later, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but where often the provision of incitement to commit an offense is used and people are charged under anti-terror legislation through these laws. And a number of Commonwealth countries have these laws and have actually used them not against people who are actually inciting violence, but against human rights defenders who are taking up these unpopular causes. And another thing, a lot of the Commonwealth is in the global south, and we all